Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 6th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. 10th of October marks World Mental Health Day, and this year's theme is suicide prevention. I'm not going to be talking specifically about this today, but you can hear more in episode 2, How and Why to Talk About Suicide at Work. But as World Mental Health Day falls in Black History Month, I'm going to be focusing on how to engage all staff to understand how Black and minority ethnicity / global majority communities face barriers with mental health stigma, treatment and prejudice. I'll introduce you to ways of thinking about this differently so you can help to equalise the playing field in and outside work. This may be particularly useful if you work with colleagues from various cultural backgrounds and those of you who work with students in university settings. I've decided to focus on this issue for this episode because I feel there's been more and more talk about this subject over the last 12 months, and I'm really pleased to see that because I think culture and mental health is something that we need to talk about more. Last year in 2018, during November, I was asked to create a specific training session for university accommodation providers. So these were support staff that worked with international students. Mental ill health had become more of an issue. During the session, delegates shared their insights on the ways in which certain cultures did or didn't engage with talking about and accessing support for their mental health. And interestingly, during September, there was a lot of discussion about mental health and supporting mental ill health in universities. And it's a topic that's not going to go away. In fact, some of you might have heard Norman Lamb, the former health minister, say that universities should be legally accountable for mental health statistics and students' mental health. And I think that's a debate that's going to be rumbling on. But indeed, for businesses, global companies and working environments, not being aware of the way in which various cultures approach mental health can be detrimental. We know that 6 days lost due to mental ill health in the UK cost around £105 billion per year. Being aware of inclusion and how to promote the services you have will be essential to ensuring all staff access provision and can stay well or get the support they need when they are not their mental optimum. So, what is mental health? And I always ask this question during my training sessions because I think the term mental can conflate and people jump to the conclusion around mental illness. So when I ask this question as an icebreaker to many of my sessions, delegates will often talk about illness, depression, not coping, and for some it brings painful images of old asylums to the forefront of their mind. But I think it's really important to recognise that mental health is the health of our mind. It's our psychological and emotional well-being. And essentially, it's how we cope with life's ups and downs, how we may manage stress, and how we form, sustain, create, and manage all the different types of relationships in our lives. Just as we do with physical health, we need to look after our mental health proactively. As I say, not many of us can just get up and run a marathon, although I appreciate some people can. We have to train for it and look after ourselves. And mentally, we won't be able to run our life marathon either without looking after our mental health. So just as eating well and keeping active not only benefit our physical body, they will also benefit our mental health. Now, each culture, and we all come from a cultural background, whether that's in terms of ethnicity, nationality, or our family culture, we will have certain models around mental health and thinking about mental ill health. So the first one is cultural stigma. So what's expected of us in our particular culture or society? What are the societal norms? And when we're well, how do we appear? How should we cover up when we don't feel particularly well? And what are the stigmas and assumptions around mental illness? And then there's something called explanatory models. And this is all about how cultures explain things, explain mental illness. So an example could be if someone is experiencing psychosis, this could be in certain cultures seen as a possession by an evil spirit or force, but it could also be that someone's being spoken to by a higher being. So of course, explanatory models about what happens and diagnostic terms will be different according to different cultures and languages and practices. This will impact on acceptance, risk and resilience. And then cultural isolation and support. This has an impact on how people accept their diagnosis of their mental health or their mental illness themselves and seek support. And finally, there's something known as cultural pride. So cultural and ethnic identity, pride can buffer against mental health effects of racism and prejudice. So an example could be someone from a minority group who sees someone that looks like them doing really well and talking openly about their cultural identity and mental health, provides a role model framework, and the individual might think, well, if that person can do it who looks like me, seems like me, and is from a similar cultural background to me, I can do it too. So what it then does is it gives an individual from a minority group a broader outlook than the stereotypes that people from a majority group might have about them. And of course, every single country will have some form of minority group, and that could also be in terms of intersectionality, so gender, sexual orientation, and disability status. So it incorporates the broader picture. I think it's also really important to remember that this is not just a global majority / BAME issue. It's essential that workplaces and study places take a holistic view in order to aid the recovery process for everyone. It's about creating an inclusive environment. And I do think mental health and wellness and inclusivity go hand in hand. So part of this will mean appreciating the cultural frameworks and references that play a key part of how someone will and engage with support from the medical model and the social model. Mental health and mental ill health have become more widely spoken about in the last 10 years, but I think we all know we still have a long way to go. Another popular topic in my training sessions is stigma. And when we talk about stigma, people acknowledge it has changed and shifted. However, in the workplace, people are very fearful of talking about their mental ill health because of the assumptions that other people have, work that might be taken away from them, or prejudice that they might face that they don't face when they don't declare or disclose. But then when we dig down deeper and look at what's really happening in relation to BAME mental health, it's a stark contrast. And I've provided some resources in the show notes, and this is where I've extrapolated some of these headline figures and information from. So overall, BAME communities in the UK are more likely to be diagnosed and admitted to hospital with a serious mental health condition. But then they're more likely to experience a poor outcome from this treatment, and as a result, they're more likely to disengage from mainstream mental health services, and therefore more likely to experience social exclusion and a deterioration in their mental health. Because of course, having a support system is absolutely essential to the recovery process. So to be a truly inclusive and mentally healthy organisation, you need to be aware, or organisations need to be aware of varying experiences. Another issue is that Eurocentric methods and treatments for mental ill health are usually unsuitable and culturally inappropriate to the needs of BAME communities. In certain communities, for example, Asian communities, extended family is very, very important. And what I've heard is that when Asian people may attend mainstream one-to-one counselling, they're told that they need to distance themselves from family, not take their family's opinions on board so much, and try and find solutions themselves. Well, for many people, that's simply not realistic. It's very difficult to put boundaries down with your families. Admittedly, things will need to be done, but I think counsellors and therapists who are not from that cultural framework may find it very challenging to understand that that isn't an option for people. So diaspora communities need cultural understanding in relation to oppression, structural inequality, and their values. And it can be very difficult to find this as it's rarely taught in mainstream psychiatry and counselling. By not supporting mental health in the workplace, we see a loss in productivity, morale, and increased staff turnover. It's also important to remember that talent acquisition and retention is key. We see a lot about organisations struggling to find people for key roles, lack of Black and minority ethnic representation on boards. So in order to be inclusive and talk about mental health, this is really important. Don't forget the figures: around 91 million sick days are lost each year in the UK due to mental ill health not being supported properly. And interestingly, for every £1 invested in mental health, organisations will get at the very least, a return of £1.50, but that could be as high as £9 for every £1 invested. And that's from the Stevenson and Farmer Review, released in October 2017. So what can you do to solve this? Well, perhaps not solve it, but what you can do to shift the status quo and get everyone thinking about mental health and culture in a holistic way. So if your workplace has an employee assistance program, And that is usually a service that organisations buy in to support staff with a range of issues. It's not necessarily about mental ill health, but around benefit support, childcare, elder care, etc. And it's usually you'll have an intranet site with a password and also a phone number that you can call. And most organisations will have at least a minimum of 6 face-to-face counselling sessions. But find out if they've got a diverse range of counsellors and advisors. Now, maybe it's not for you to call depending on your role directly, but talk to your HR team or occupational health. Because when people phone those lines, and if you've got a colleague who's struggling, they can request someone from a similar cultural background or someone who has cultural knowledge. And it's really important that people know that they can do this. The other important thing is, alongside your EAP, is to promote culturally specific services. And one example is the Black and Asian Therapy Network. And another example that I like to use is the Muslim Youth Helpline. So these give people an option to speak to culturally specific services about their needs. You may also like to set up a safe space to talk in your group using your staff networks, your Black and minority staff network or any other staff network, to set up a safe space where people can just talk about their mental health. And this is proactive rather than reactive. And I've included a useful toolkit from the Portman Group. And this centers on alcohol recovery. However, I think the principles can be extrapolated in terms of creating that safe space and guidelines. Ask your workplace to share good practice and raise awareness about BME mental health. So alongside mental health resources, anything specific in relation to Black and minority mental health. Because some people might not want to talk, but they might access the internet so that they can find out this information. And it's a really easy way to do it because you're just simply resharing information that's already out there. And in the show notes, you'll find a variety of resources. And why not organise training for your workplace to understand more around the connection between mental health and cultural values? These can be really interesting away days and coaching sessions where people can talk about how they're feeling, what culture is, because of course everyone has a culture. We're focusing specifically on Black and minority ethnic mental health, but actually everyone can talk about culture in relation to mental health. And it's a really good segue to thinking more broadly about the challenges and what you can do. And I think by creating an open space to talk about this problem, it helps with staff retention, creates an inclusive workplace, and lets people know they are valued and can speak about their mental health and their cultural context. We all have mental health, and cultural frameworks will influence how we view our mental health and access help if we become unwell. Health outcomes for BAME communities in the UK are far worse than for white majority counterparts for both physical and mental health. And we can all do something to equalise the playing field in the workplace and beyond. So why not explore more on this topic using the resources I have provided in the show notes? They are based on a mixture of surveys and in-depth reports so you can understand more about health inequality from a public health perspective. I've also included 2 slides around cultural frameworks on mental health that you might find useful. And I create bespoke training in this area to link culture and mental health together. So why not get in touch with me and find out more? I'd love to have a chat with you, so please book a time to have a phone call with me on my Calendly. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode on culture and Black mental health for Black History Month. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.